So that's kind of what reason why when Obama had this big success, and everyone's saying, gee, this is really amazing here. You know, we've never seen anything like this. How did we have this incredibly disciplined approach and everything? How did this happen? Well, it's rooted in the UFW and what people learned. Because after most people left the UFW, by 1981, and they took their skills and their strategies, like I say, beyond the fields. And that's why it's a story that's important, not because it's a history book. This is not a history book. It's a book that explains, you know, how we got to where we are today. And just, you know, the immigrant rights movement, I'll give you just another great example. When you say to people, how is it that millions of people took to the streets in 2006? How did it happen? What do people think? Was it all the disc jockeys, the Spanish disc jockeys in Los Angeles revving everybody up? Was it because the Sensenbrenner bill was passed and people just kind of spontaneously in the Latino community said, let's take to the streets? That's what the media, I think, believes, that it's just kind of this spontaneous opposition to the draconian Sensenbrenner bill, which criminalized people who even help immigrants. What actually happened was, starting in 1995 and 1996, people at Fred Ross Jr. was working for a group in Los Angeles with the Industrial Areas Foundation, and they ran this national campaign called the Active Citizenship Campaign. And the goal was to get all these Latinos to become citizens after passage of this 1986 immigration bill. Well, you know, if you look at how many Latinos were trying to become citizens from 1986 to 1994, the numbers are really low. Latinos were not becoming citizens, they weren't voting, and they weren't involved in voter outreach. Suddenly, this campaign starts. They get a farm worker guy, Fred Ross Jr., to run this campaign in Los Angeles. It soon becomes a national campaign. You soon have Al Gore and Bill Clinton raising hell with the then INS saying, why aren't you processing these citizenship applications? You know, that's how quickly, if you have the skills, you can go from just working in a community in the Valley of Los Angeles, and suddenly the President of the United States and the Vice President are making it a top priority. So after they succeeded, and the details are all in the book about how we get to that point, but after they succeeded in getting people citizens so they could vote in the 96 election, they keep it up. And they say, and Eliseo Medina says, we've got to change labor's view toward immigrants. Because historically, the AFL-CIO had been against immigrants. They've been restrictive. They said immigrants take jobs. But we need them in our camp. So he started working on that. He also started working with Cardinal Mahoney in Los Angeles. If people know Cardinal Mahoney, he was the first head of the Agricultural Labor Relations Board. He was a big ally of Cesar Chavez. But in 1989, he got into a rift with organized labor in Los Angeles over the organizing of Catholic cemetery workers. And so by the mid-90s, the Cardinal was not really, he didn't feel comfortable really working with labor in a close way. But Eliseo tried to get that rapprochement, which he did. And so in 2000, you have John Wilhelm from Unite Here playing a very major role, along with Eliseo, with SCIU, and others, in getting the AFL-CIO to suddenly say, we're for immigrant rights, which was a dramatic change. You have the church in the form of Mahoney, a very influential cardinal, saying, we want to be part of the movement for immigrant rights. Then you have a campaign, and I'm going to ask this, and if you know, two of you should answer this question because you know it, but how many people have heard of the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride? Okay, not very many. And as I say in the book, there's an event that occurred in 2003. I was in New Orleans at this organizers meeting in December 2002, and the former head of ACORN, Wade Rathman, was talking about this, what we all thought was this incredibly crazy idea that Unite Here and unions are going to put all this energy into this Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride, which is a bus trip to highlight immigrant rights. And we were all thinking, God, with all the problems in the country, you know, the Republicans got the Senate back in 2002, why are we doing this? Makes no sense. Well, if you study the history, and Dave Glazer here was the actual chair of it. The formal chair was Maria Elena Durazo, Miguel Contreras' wife, who was a big activist and now head of the LA Labor Council. But they saw something that none of us saw, which is that this Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride would create relationships Because you had buses, think of this for a second. You have buses going through all these small towns across America, and they're making connections with immigrant rights people wherever they go. Now that's brilliant. Most of us didn't see it. Fortunately, Dave and some others did. And so they created this incredible event, the Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride, which the media largely ignored. Now, the New York Times did do a story at the end, and sometimes went to certain towns, and there were some small stories, but none of us have heard of it, right? Well, okay, suddenly 2006 rolls around, and people are saying, we got to respond to the Sensenbrenner bill. We have to really send a message for immigrant rights. Well, they had all these relationships created through the Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride. So it wasn't like, God, who do we call in Tulsa? Who do we call in Nashville? They knew who to call. They'd worked with them 3 years earlier. That was the brilliance of it. You know, that was really the brilliance of it. So, 2006 happens, and I say that, you know, I have a whole thing on the whole 2006, and because it wasn't a spontaneous take to the streets from people in the Latino community, it was heavily labor unions and the religious community pulling people out and getting them out. Now, labor tried to downplay their views. I talked about that because they didn't want to make it seem like it was a labor thing, but it was. And it was, and that's why the whole tenor of it was so, there were the American flags. You know, when you saw those, remember the American flags were all in the immigrant rights marches? That came from the farm workers movement. Caesar once was always accused of being a communist, so he said, okay, we're going to always have American flags. You know, I remember, and back in when Gary Guthman, who I talked about as sort of the guy who got me sort of connected to the farm workers movement, when I worked closely with Kevin for Unite Here, they're organizing a restaurant, the Lafayette restaurant on Montgomery Street. One of the many successful organizing drives that Unite Here did, Local 2 did around restaurants that after they succeed, the restaurant would close. It's hard to close a hotel. But I'll never forget on like July 2nd or July 3rd of like probably 1980 or 81, Gary had this American flag that had to be 15 feet size, and he was waving the American flag in support of the organizing drive. You know, so the farm worker folks got it. And you saw that mentality in the immigrant rights marches, and that's why they were received so well by the media, and that's why they were so successful. So that's the kind of stuff the book talks about, how the ideas, the strategies, and the people who came from the movement have made such a difference and still make a difference today. And as I say, we owe them all great thanks, because that farm worker movement, the fact that 40 years later is still producing leaders of our major today's movements is really something else. It's really something, and you know, you have Sharon DeLugich, who is right now organizing for Obama in southern Missouri. Sharon was 15 years old. She goes to a local Save-On drugstore, and she sees this farm worker table and decides, hey, this sounds like fun. Drops out of high school to work for the farm workers, is such a great organizer to bring her up to Oakland to work on the boycott. But they can't make her a boycott leader because she wasn't old enough to drive. I mean, that's where you see Paul Milne, similar story, you know, where these folks, you know, a lot of these folks skipped college because they were so committed. So that's kind of the big picture idea of the book also, is to give great thanks and recognition to people who really haven't gotten it and haven't sought it over the years. So with that, I'll take questions, and thank you all for coming. Thank you. Any questions about anything? Yeah. Tony.
Did you get the interview Eliseo for this book?
Yes. Yes. And I actually saw Eliseo in Denver at the convention. We had a nice long talk and everything, and he's very optimistic. A lot of people would not think that immigrant rights, the legalization is like a dead deal. Quite the contrary. Eliseo is going to happen next year. You're going to see a huge, you know, like I say, it was first we march, then we vote, and they voted in 2006, they're going to vote in 2008, and then it's back to the streets to pass legalization, you know, comprehensive reform, and he's into it. So he's very optimistic. Yeah.
Aside from the slogan, do you see any connection between Obama's organizing campaign and the UFW organizing?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, the whole, I have a quote in the book about the fundamental, what Fred Ross, who trained Cesar Chavez, not this Fred Ross Sr., I'll say Junior if it's this Fred Ross. What Fred Ross Sr. did is he brought a culture of organizing as a discipline. Some of which is missing in a lot of organizing today, but not those who train with the farm workers. It's a discipline, which means there are rules, you do things a certain way, you write things down, you keep track of names, and that's why the farm worker thing was so incredible. It was so organized that in a 1972 campaign in California, when they were fighting off an anti-farm worker measure, Prop 22, they actually invented a thing called the human billboard. You've heard of human billboards on the corners? It was invented there. But under Fred's mentality that he imposed, you kept track of everything. So you actually kept track of how many cars honked as they drove by.
Wow.
And there was a formula they created to figure out how many cars actually passed intersections, because they wanted to know that they were making a difference, you know? So it wasn't like, you know, okay, just go out there to some street corner. They wanted to know they're making a difference, so everything was always documented. That's why when you signed up at a table, you know, nowadays so often there'll be someone to ask you to sign up to do something. You sign up, never hear from them again. But when you signed up at a UFW table, you got a call that night. And they ask you to do something the next day. And if you said, because remember, well, you just signed up, right? Oh yeah, okay, fine, I'll go out to that thing. And then you'd have a good experience. But today's groups often would say, okay, see you later. They would then call you to do something else. And you'd get hooked in. And it'd be so much fun because it was a whole life, remember. It wasn't like it is now where you, like a 9-to-5 activist job or weekend, you lived in a boycott house, you lived with other people, it became it was a, you know, a round-the-clock movement that was like, hey, this is really meaningful, this is great, let's stay in it. And that's what happened. But it was the basic discipline of not just having a list and putting it aside, and maybe I'll call these people in 3 weeks, but rather, we're going to call them tonight, because that's, you know, and I tell a story about the discipline, because I noticed when you read about the Obama campaign, everyone's saying, God, it's amazing, they keep statistics on everything, and they're really keeping track of everything. You know, no, remember, in those days with the farm workers, the Industrial Areas Foundation, a lot of the religious-based networks, they didn't do candidate politics. They didn't do electoral politics. That's why Cesar left the Community Services Organization, because they didn't do candidates. The farm workers were unusual, so they were more involved in electoral politics of candidates, which is why they developed this model and other groups did not. Because they were so heavily involved from 68 with Robert Kennedy, 72 George McGovern, and then the 72 ballot initiative, the 68, 76 ballot initiative, that they were training people in this, but it was a highly disciplined thing. And I have some quotes in the book about people remembering, they just couldn't believe it because they weren't, you know, how many bumper stickers did you give out? The records were kept. And so people felt what they were doing had meaning. And this is very important because it felt they had meaning, because if you're just going out there and dropping stuff and no one seems to care what you did, then you don't really feel very important. But if it's like, you know, the big charts everywhere where they're writing up and you're counting how many honks we got, how many cars passed, and they're getting up at 5 in the morning to be on these intersections holding up the human billboards. So, you know, you're getting up at 5 in the morning, hey, we got, you know, 300 honks today, and yesterday we only had 200. That's great, and that's what I've heard the Obama campaign, when you read about it, people feel important, you know. But what they also did, and I think, you know, if you look at the culture of Unite here, it's also that discipline. It's the same thing. I mean, I remember we had a long-running dispute here at Park 55 Hotel. And I remember I'd see Kevin O'Connor, because Kevin was in charge of the boycott. I think you were in charge of that, weren't you, the Park 55? Around. And it went on, how long did it go on for again?
4 years.
4 years. Like, it goes on, and I said, Kevin, how do you do it? And I think, you know, and he can tell me if I'm wrong, I think when you work for the UFW, you get this mentality that now is throughout Unite here, that you just, you know, no matter how long it lasts, you're going to outlast them. That's what happened to the Marriott campaign that went on for 7 years. I mean, you're never going to outlast this, but there's a strike right now in the Congress Hotel in Chicago, and I write about all this in the book, because if you want to have like just really fun organizing tactics, check out what went on in Chicago and Boston and these hotel boycotts. It's really brilliant. It's been going on for 6 years. And they're not going away. A hotel has almost no business, you know. But I think that was, because you remember, there was never an end game to the farm workers movement. Cesar Chavez starts organizing farm workers in 1962. There was not something like, okay, well, in 1970 it's going to end. It wasn't an election. You had to eventually win state legislation. So, you know, how do you keep motivated when there's no end? And after, you know, and so it takes a certain mentality. You have to really believe in the power of what you're doing. And you have to believe this is really, really important and meaningful beyond just you win this one thing. And that's what the farm workers imparted. And I think we've had a hard time doing that since then. I think we've had a very hard time getting people to feel that what they're doing is so important that they would work for 10 years, 15 years if need be, to make it happen. So I think the sense of discipline and accountability is really central to sort of what the farm worker movement has spread to other unions, to other movements. And then again, you get people imposing, you know, from other places. Like again, with Unite here, John Wilhelm is not from the farm workers. You know, Dave Grazer's not from the farm workers. But I think there's other traditions that kind of mesh, and it all becomes this really highly disciplined approach. And really, the big picture, though, Cesar Chavez's influence, particularly on religious and faith and the framing of issues, is just far greater than I think people realize. Any other?
Well, you mentioned religious and spiritual. Wasn't one of the things about the United Farm Workers, as opposed to other labor struggles, is that they did really frame it in spiritual terms to keep people motivated in it?
Yes, and I think that's sort of been written out of the history of the UFW and Cesar Chavez. Cesar's become a very secular figure in our history. He's like a Latino icon, but he was profoundly religious. The original organizers for the UFW, what became the UFW, were migrant ministers and Protestant migrant ministers. He had to wage a major campaign to win the support of the Catholic Church. Everybody always thinks that, of course, they were the Catholics because the workers were Catholic. But who were the growers? And who funded the churches, right? And the Catholic bishops knew which side their bread was buttered on. Bobby Kennedy did a hearing in 1966 in the fields, and he actually lectured the Catholic bishops. He said not only was it disgraceful that they were thinking of supporting or being neutral, but that he said it was the bishop's duty to support the farm worker cause. You know, and you know, I talk in the book how all these alliances you see today between labor gets involved in a fight, they bring in the church right away now. That was not the case in the farm workers. The farm workers made that happen. And really through the 60s and 70s, not till almost 89, did other unions start doing that. So again, Justice for Janitors, every campaign they do, there's a religious component. You know, it's really, it's because that's the UFW tradition. You build this broad community. We were in this room when the National Hotel Worker Rising campaign was being planned. Local 2 held a meeting in this room to build community support. Now, most of labor in the 1960s and 70s were not seeking community support for their struggles. That came out of the farm worker tradition and now is the broader tradition in the labor movement of seeking community support, including religious, including students. Nobody worked with students till Cesar Chavez. No labor union worked with students. If you were a woman and you wanted to be an activist organizer, labor organizer for a male-dominant industry, there were no jobs for you. If you wonder why all these great women were at the UFW, where else were they going to be? There weren't jobs. SEIU, in its previous connotation, had some jobs in women, like for when they were doing the clerical workers in women industry, they had women organizers, but not in the male industry like the farm workers were. You know, if you were progressive, if you were like an activist movement kind of person, and you wanted to be involved in the labor movement in the 1960s, you're going to work with George Meany? George Meany I talk in the book, wasn't real complimentary about the farm worker movement and the kind of young people. Remember, AFL-CIO was for support of the Vietnam War. So you're there and you're an activist and you want to help workers, you're not going to go work for the AFL-CIO. And I talk in the book, a number of people said, you know, that was the entry. If you were an activist, new left kind of person, your entry into the labor movement could only be made through the farm workers. There was no other entry point. And thank goodness people like Susan Chasian, Jessica Govey, Dolores Huerta had those openings, or they would have not made the difference they made. And there's a whole bunch more of women who've just, just a huge number. And I should mention that, I mentioned Unite Here and SEIU and the spin-offs. Fred Ross Jr. created a group in the 80s called Neighbor to Neighbor, which took the farm worker grape and lettuce boycott and shifted it over to boycotting coffee, and ended up putting such pressure on El Salvador's military government, the coffee growers, that it brought peace to El Salvador, ended the civil war in El Salvador. And I talk in the details in the book, but what happened with Neighbor to Neighbor, they brought Fred Ross Sr. to train some of the people. And so they all got inculcated with this great discipline. Today, and I have a chart in the book that talks about where all these people went and the great work they've done. Today, all these Neighbor to Neighbor people are out organizing for SEIU and for other places. It's just remarkable how people, it's like a tree that keeps sprouting branches and roots for future movements. And that's really what I think is what the farm workers and how it all came about. There's a guy who worked for Neighbor to Neighbor named John Adler, who's now with SEIU, and he's in Ohio working on the campaign. He said, I have a quote in this in the book, he says, he learned more in 2 weeks from Fred Ross than 4 years at Yale. And that was the experience. People just went through that experience with Fred and thought that suddenly a world had opened up of understanding of how organizing works that they had never understood before. So that's kind of the root, the trunk, and then the branches have gone off and are still, as people train and young organizers come into these unions, I think we're going to see further expansion. So I actually think this Obama electoral model is really from the UFW, and really from the 1949 Edmund Roybal campaign through the UFW campaigns in the 60s and 70s. I discuss in the book how Fred Ross Jr., Marshall Gans, and others worked on campaigns in the 80s. Nancy Pelosi's political career was made possible by the farm worker alumni who used very House meetings and absentee voting and other things to elect her. So you look, everywhere you look, you're going to start seeing, God, there's farm worker people involved. Any other questions at all? Yeah.
Yeah, Randy, I just wanted to comment that Ohio and Florida were so important for the election of the Democratic president. They're not important anymore because of the Latino vote.
That's a great point. And we keep saying, why are they, that because Colorado, particularly New Mexico's not in play anymore, Nevada's turning. I'm sure maybe Mike give some insight. Is Unite Here going to take Nevada for us? Is we going to win? Is Obama? You guys have put a lot of resources in Nevada in 2004 and 2008. I think it is strange how the Latino vote has not gotten the level of attention. I think where you really see the Latino vote getting attention, in Texas, it's quite possible that one of the legislative bodies will go with the Democrats because of Latino voting. This might be the last time this will be the last presidential election where Texas is not in play. That's going to freak out the country. That's going to start becoming, when Texas is no longer a solid red state, and this could be the last time that it is. They're doing a lot of work, and for Eliseo personally, Texas is a big priority because he spent so many years in Houston. He organized Houston janitors and did a lot of stuff. For a lot of people, Texas is really a place where they want to sort of make some gains. Well, if there, yeah.
I'm wondering if the farm workers wouldn't have created so many new strategies and techniques for union organizers. I wonder why over the last 25 years the union movement has been so eviscerated in the United States.
Well, that's a great question, but it's very hard to win elections, and with all the problems it is and all the the money spent. That's why they're trying to get the Employer Free Choice Act passed. I think that's one of the reasons Labor's so involved in this election, because they know they have to change the rules. I mean, if you look at the amount of time Unite Here was voting on, they'd win all these elections in these restaurants. I mean, I can name so many restaurants in San Francisco. I mean, there was New York Deli in the Castro district where they had a huge campaign. Paprika Fono at the Ghirardelli Square. They'd win all these restaurants. I don't mean to bring up bad memories, but I mean, they'd win all these elections. And then the employer would go out of business, and so, that's after you invest all this time. So it's so easy to circumvent the thing, and that's, hotels don't go out of business much, but, you know, you have a situation like the Congress Hotel where there's European owners, we don't care, we'll lose money for 10 years. So there's a lot of obstacles to it. You know, one thing I make about the farm workers movement, look at the amazing talent that was there. And they won this victory, but look at the talent level that was there. I mean, we've never had any organization with that level of talent. And that's what it took. Anything less than that, they wouldn't have won. So it's very difficult, and that's why the Employer Free Choice Act, I think it might change some things.
And what is that?
That's the one that changes the procedure. You don't have to have a secret ballot election. It's more of a card check, you know, I think, you know, that's one of the issues that's going to be, certainly Labor's putting so much money in this election. They want to see that happen, and I think some version of it will, because as you know, elections can be stalled out for years. And Fred right now is organizing the nation's biggest organizing drive at St. Joseph's Hospital. And they had, which is a statewide chain, 9,000 workers here in California. Well, they tried to have an election, but what happened, Fred? How many violations were there of the
More than 70.
Yeah, I mean, so they have an election, and the employer just violates 70 violations of the law. And so the election gets thrown out, and so the union says, well, why don't you agree to card check? And the employer's saying, no, we want to have another election. Now, that's pretty stupid if you agree to that. Well, haven't we already played this game? But that's the problem, is why don't you keep violating the law? And then, you know, so it has to have the kind of grassroots pressure that a lot of the ex-farm worker types in the Unite here and SAU end up having to do. You know, so that's what happens. And then the employer will keep saying, as doing St. Joseph's, we just want to have an election. And that's their public position. Why won't the union agree to election? Well, because you had one and you cheated. You know? Any other thoughts? If not, I'm always happy to come up afterwards, happy to sign your book. And again, you know, it's a very hot day, and I thank you all for coming. And we'll get it up on YouTube and spread the word to your friends. Thank you. And if you've got a book, make sure you get one of my book